March 4th, 1970, Hammond, Indiana. One woman, one shotgun, one house in flames. And the craziest part, she climbed over a 10-foot barbed wire fence with her bare hands and disappeared for 35 years. Linda Darby was convicted of murdering her husband, Charles. On March 13th, 1972, she scaled the fence at Indiana Women's Prison, covered in blood, and vanished. But this isn't just a story about a prison escape. It's about a woman who built an entirely new life under a fake name. The community that loved her for 3 decades without knowing the truth. And the single act of kindness that brought it all crashing down. She changed 1 digit of her social security number. 1 digit. And that was enough to fool everyone for 35 years. This is how a convicted killer became a beloved grandmother, and how one knock on the door ended it all. Linda and Charles Darby got married in the late 1960s. Charles was Linda's second husband. She already had 4 children from her previous marriage. Together, they had 1 more child. That made Linda a mother of 5. People who knew her said she was a good mother, devoted to her children. But there were things about Linda that were harder to ignore. In 1969, something strange started happening. Their fence was set on fire. Their car was vandalized and stolen, and then their home was burned to the ground. Linda believed the harassment was connected to Charles's work. He was a subcontractor who installed aluminum siding on buildings. He wasn't in the local union, and in those days, not being in the union could make you a target. But was that really the reason? Or was something else going on? The harassment was serious enough to force them to move. They relocated to Beach Street in Hammond, Indiana. A fresh start, a new beginning for the family. But the problems didn't stop. They just changed form. Linda had developed a spending problem. She was writing checks they couldn't cover, racking up debt they couldn't afford. When Charles confronted her about the money, she told him something that stopped him cold. She said she needed the money for cancer treatment. She said she didn't have health insurance through him. She asked him what he wanted her to do. Die? Charles backed off. How could he argue with a wife fighting cancer? But Linda didn't have cancer. She was perfectly healthy. She had lied about one of the most devastating diagnoses a person can receive. She had used it to manipulate her husband into silence. 5 children were now living with the fear that their mother was dying, and none of it was true. What kind of person lies about having cancer to cover up a spending habit? When Charles eventually discovered the truth, he was devastated. He felt betrayed on every level, and he retaliated in the worst way he could think of. He went to the local newspaper and placed an ad stating that he was not responsible for Linda's debts, only his own. Linda was humiliated, furious. The entire community could now see the cracks in their marriage. Neither of them was handling this well. Charles had the moral high ground, but he destroyed it with that public humiliation. Linda had started the chain of lies, and now neither of them could trust the other. How bad does a marriage have to get before someone ends up dead? Then came New Year's Eve, 1969. Someone anonymously called the local newspaper and reported that Linda and Charles Darby had died in a car accident. The paper printed their obituaries. The couple was very much alive. Who made that call? Was it the same people who had harassed them before? Had they been tracked to their new address? Or was it someone closer to home? It was never determined who provided the false information, but the timing was unsettling. By March 1970, the marriage was in ruins. Trust was gone. Debt was piling up, and the tension between them was unbearable. On the first weekend of March 1970, Linda decided to take her children on a trip to Ashland, Kentucky. She wanted to visit her father, a normal trip, a chance for the kids to see their grandfather. Charles wasn't feeling well, so he stayed home. Given the state of their relationship, traveling together probably wasn't a priority for either of them. On March 3, 1970, Linda was driving back from Kentucky with her 5 children. The journey was almost 7 hours long. She was less than an hour from home, but she decided to stop. She checked into a Holiday Inn in Valparaiso with her children. She said she was too tired to keep driving. But then she did something strange. She asked the hotel staff for a 10 p.m. wake-up call. Why would a woman who checked into a hotel because she was exhausted ask to be woken up at 10 o'clock at night? March 4th, 1970, around midnight, a fire broke out at the Darby home in Hammond. There had been an explosion. Firefighters were called and arrived quickly. They extinguished the flames. Immediately, they could smell gasoline. The entire house reeked of it. Someone had used it as an accelerant. The firefighters initially believed the house was empty, but once they got the fire under control, they found him. Charles Darby, lying on a mattress. The fire hadn't killed him. Charles Darby had been shot in the heart. What started as a fire investigation became a murder investigation in seconds. And the police had one suspect from the very beginning, Linda Darby. She wasn't supposed to be home. She was at a hotel. But that hotel was less than an hour's drive from the house. She had asked for a wake-up call at 10 p.m., and her daughter told the police something devastating. Linda had left the hotel room that night. Her daughter didn't know exactly when. She didn't know where her mother went. But she knew one thing. Linda had told her not to tell anyone she had left. She told her daughter to say she had been in the room all night. Why would a mother tell her child to lie about her whereabouts on the night her husband was murdered? Then the evidence started piling up. A shotgun was found hidden behind a vending machine at the Holiday Inn. Forensic analysis couldn't conclusively prove it was the murder weapon, but an expert stated it was consistent with the weapon used to kill Charles Darby. And a neighbor confirmed that the gun had belonged to the Darbys. They had sold it to Charles themselves. So why was a gun sold to the Darby family, hidden at the hotel where Linda was staying? Hotel staff also found clothing left behind in Linda's room. A shop worker named Guy Rosen identified these clothes as being worn by a woman who came into his convenience store on the night of March 3rd. That woman had purchased 2 gallons of gasoline. She took away a gas can and brought it back sometime after midnight. The gas cans were analyzed for fingerprints. None were found. But the identification placed someone matching Linda's description buying gasoline on the night of the murder. Tire tracks from Linda's station wagon were examined and matched to tracks found at the house. Now, Linda lived at that address. Her tire tracks being there wasn't exactly shocking. But for the prosecution, it was another piece of the puzzle. And then the autopsy revealed something else. Something that changed everything. Arsenic was found in Charles Darby's blood. The poison, arsenic. Investigators theorized he had been poisoned over several months. Was Charles being slowly poisoned before someone finally pulled the trigger? Linda was arrested the day after her husband's funeral. She hadn't attended the funeral. The police had been waiting for her there, ready to arrest her. But Linda had gone to Kentucky to stay with family instead. Think about that for a moment. A wife whose husband has just been murdered. A funeral is being held. And she doesn't show up. She goes back to Kentucky, while her husband's body was being laid to rest in Indiana. Was she running? Was she grieving in her own way? Or did she already know that the police were closing in? A grieving wife who doesn't attend her husband's funeral. Who goes to stay with relatives in another state while the investigation is unfolding? It didn't look good. It didn't look innocent. While awaiting trial, Linda was released on bond, and she went on holiday with her family. From the moment of her arrest, Linda protested her innocence. She said she had absolutely nothing to do with her husband's death. She maintained that position throughout the trial and has never wavered from it. Her defense team argued there was a lack of physical evidence. They had planned to call 14 witnesses. Instead, they rested their case without calling a single one. Their argument was simple. The prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Linda was in Hammond on the night of March 3rd. No fingerprints on the gas canisters. The clothing was supposed to be tested for gasoline residue, but the results were never revealed. The defense believed the prosecution's case was weak. The prosecution disagreed. They presented the tire track evidence. They called Linda's own daughter, who testified that her mother had left the hotel that night and told her to lie about it. They presented the shotgun found at the hotel, with expert testimony that it was consistent with the murder weapon. The gas station attendants who identified Linda weren't allowed to physically testify. The court determined that police had tainted the identification process by showing them a photo of Linda before the lineup. But did any of that matter to the jury? On September 24, 1970, Linda Darby was found guilty of the murder of her husband. On October 1, 1970, she was sentenced to life in prison. She would be eligible for parole after 15 years. Linda's response was clear. She said she was not a murderer. She said she didn't understand how they could have convicted her. But Linda wasn't going to wait 15 years for parole. She wasn't going to wait at all. March 13, 1972, Indiana Women's Prison. 2 years into her life sentence, 730 days behind bars, Linda had spent every one of them maintaining the same thing, that she was innocent, that she didn't belong here, that she was paying for a crime someone else committed. And she decided she was done waiting. Indiana Women's Prison wasn't a maximum security facility, but it wasn't easy to leave. The perimeter was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Sharp, twisted metal designed to shred anything that tried to cross it. No tools to cut through it, no tunnels to dig under it, no accomplices waiting on the other side. Linda had one option: climb. Could she make it over 10 feet of chain link and barbed wire without being spotted? She approached the fence, grabbed the chain link with her bare hands, and started pulling herself up, link by link, foot by foot. The metal dug into her fingers, her shoes scraped against the fence. Every second she was exposed, visible, vulnerable. She reached the top, the barbed wire. This was where most people would have stopped. The wire was designed to stop exactly this. Sharp barbs angled outward, twisted coils meant to trap and tear. There was no clean way over. Linda went through it anyway. The barbs tore into her hands, ripped through her clothing, cut deep gashes into her arms and legs. Wire scraped across her face. Blood ran down her forearms. Pain was everywhere. She dropped to the other side. Free, bleeding, alone. By the time she hit the ground, she looked like someone who had been brutally attacked. Her face was scratched and swollen. Her arms were shredded. Blood soaked through her clothing. She didn't look like an escaped convict. She looked like a victim. And that became her greatest weapon. She knocked on doors in the neighborhood surrounding the prison. A woman, bleeding and desperate. She told strangers she had been beaten up by a boyfriend. People believed her instantly. Why wouldn't they? The injuries were real. The blood was real. The fear on her face was real. No one suspected she was a convicted killer who had just torn herself over a prison fence. At one of those homes, she met a man named Willie McElroy Jr. His family called him Junior. He took one look at this injured woman and decided to help her. He didn't ask too many questions. He just saw someone who needed help. What happened next would define the next 35 years of both their lives. Junior brought Linda back to Pulaski, a city about 75 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee. This was where he had grown up, and Linda fell for him. He fell for her. She took his name, called him her husband. But did they ever actually get married? Pulaski authorities said they could never find any evidence the couple married on a legal basis. It was a common law arrangement, a life built on a foundation that didn't technically exist, just like Linda's new identity. She changed one digit of her social security number. One single digit. That was her entire disguise. And it worked for 35 years. Linda took up jobs babysitting and cleaning. She did whatever she needed to make money. She and Junior had 2 children together. That made Linda a mother of 7. She became a grandmother to 8 grandchildren. They eventually opened a secondhand store together. She volunteered at her grandchildren's school. She got involved in the community. She made friends. She became someone people relied on, someone people trusted. She helped neighbors when they needed it. She checked on the elderly. She showed up when it mattered. 35 years. That's longer than most marriages last. Linda had been free for longer than some of her neighbors had been alive. She had built a life that was completely normal, completely law-abiding. And that's what made it so effective. She didn't hide by running to another country. She didn't live off the grid in some remote cabin. She hid in the most brilliant way possible. She hid by being ordinary, by being helpful, by being the kind of person nobody would ever suspect of anything. But what about her 5 children from before, the ones she left behind when she climbed that fence? Linda made absolutely no contact with them. For 35 years, she didn't call. She didn't write. She didn't send a message through anyone. She cut off her entire previous life completely. She said the temptation was always there. She missed them constantly, but she knew that any contact could lead authorities back to her. So she stayed silent. She said she cried herself to sleep many nights. She said she used to pray and ask God to let her raise her new children in peace. How does a mother live for 35 years without contacting her own children? Linda never told anyone about her past. Not Junior, not her new children, not her friends. Nobody in Pulaski knew that the kind woman who volunteered at school and ran the secondhand store had been convicted of murder and escaped from prison. She said she kept the secret to protect the people around her. If anyone knew, they could be charged as co-conspirators or for obstructing justice. She didn't want to put that burden on anyone. But there was another reason she could keep the secret so well. Linda was good at lying. She had lied about having cancer without blinking. She had told her daughter to provide a false alibi on the night her husband died. Could it be that she simply invented an entire past that never existed and lived inside that fiction for 3.5 decades? At some point, Linda and Junior's romantic relationship ended. Some sources say they separated. Others say they remained together. But whatever the nature of their relationship, they stayed close. They remained friends. They continued working together at the store. There was no bad blood between them. For 35 years, life was quiet. No crimes, no incidents, no trouble of any kind. Linda lived what many described as a flawless life. But luck always runs out. In 2007, a new fugitive task force was formed in Indiana. Their mission was simple: find the ones who got away. They began reviewing cold cases and escaped prisoners who had never been recaptured. Files that had gathered dust for decades were reopened. Names that had been forgotten were run through modern databases, and Linda's name came up. They started digging. Modern technology had changed everything since 1972. Digital records, interstate databases, tools that didn't exist when Linda climbed that fence. The break came from the most unexpected source. Linda had acted as a witness in an assault case. She had walked into a courtroom to help another person by testifying against their attacker. A good deed, a civic duty, the kind of thing a decent person does. But that single act put her name back into the system, and this time, the system was paying attention. The authorities cross-referenced records. They matched her. They found her. Remember that one digit she changed on her social security number? It had fooled everyone for 35 years, but it couldn't fool a task force with modern technology. October 19th, 2007, Pulaski, Tennessee. Linda was 64 years old. She was fixing dinner when there was a knock at the door. Her daughter answered. A police officer stood there, a man Linda had known for years. He showed her an old photograph of herself. He asked her if she knew who the woman in the picture was. Linda looked at the photo. She looked at the officer she had known for 3 decades, and she made a decision. She said, "That's me. I could sit here all day and lie to you, but fingerprints don't lie." The officer was stunned. He had known Linda for 30 years. He told the investigators they had it wrong. The woman he knew was not capable of killing anyone. But the fingerprints matched. The community of Pulaski was in shock, complete and total disbelief. Linda's neighbor, Mrs. Slater, said they were flabbergasted. She didn't seem like that type of person. Another neighbor, 85-year-old Mrs. Gordon, said Linda would call and check on her regularly. She said they really loved her and hated what was happening. Linda's friend, Miss Gilbert, said when Linda arrived in Pulaski, she just fell into place. She was family. Her departure felt like part of the family had been taken away. The police captain of Pulaski, John Dickey, said he had known Linda for 16 years. He called her a real good citizen. He said he was genuinely surprised. How does an entire community not see what's hiding in plain sight? Or was there nothing to see at all? After her capture, Linda told her common-law husband and children about her past for the first time. She said they supported her. They believed in her innocence. And many people in Pulaski believed her too. For more than 30 years, she had lived a flawless life. No trouble, no crimes, nothing. But the family of Charles Darby had waited 35 years for this moment. Charles's sister Alice Robinette said they were Christians and didn't believe in revenge, but she was glad they caught Linda. She hoped they would never let her go again. Charles's niece said Linda needed to pay for her crime. She got to live. Charles didn't. Charles Darby was 25 years old when he died. He was a Navy veteran who had served on the USS Enterprise during the Vietnam era. He was the father of an infant son. He deserved justice. Whatever the truth about Linda, that fact never changes. Linda said she had considered turning herself in over the years, but she said she didn't want to go back and pay for someone else's crime. If she was innocent, that logic made perfect sense. If she was guilty, it was just another lie in a lifetime of lies. Here's the irony. If Linda had served her time, she could have been eligible for parole after 15 years. She had already served 2 before she escaped. 13 more years, and she could have walked out the front door. Instead, she spent 35 years looking over her shoulder, and now she would likely die behind bars. On June 28, 2019, Linda filed for post-conviction relief. She argued that her original trial lawyers had been ineffective. She listed their failures. They failed to obtain a police statement. They failed to investigate potential witnesses. They failed to develop testimony about the telephone calls at the Holiday Inn. They failed to present evidence about the intensity of a shotgun blast. They failed to present evidence of suspicious marks on Charles's body. They failed to present evidence that the prosecution had requested clothing be examined for gasoline. They failed to present evidence of soil comparisons. They failed to present evidence of a prior fire. They failed to object to the prosecution's comments during rebuttal. Both of her original trial attorneys had died by the time of the hearing. No one could confirm or deny her claims. Linda also argued that if Charles had been shot at home, the neighbors would have heard. The distance between the Darby home and the next residence was only 9 feet and 5 inches. A shotgun blast at that range from the neighboring house would have been impossible to miss. She submitted an affidavit from an expert who agreed. She also argued that the police investigation of fingerprints had been inadequate, but the post-conviction court denied her relief. They determined she had not been denied effective trial counsel. Linda remains in prison. She is still claiming her innocence. Her message to the people who knew her as Linda McElroy is simple. This is who I am. I am not a murderer. I didn't do it. She said she would like to know who actually murdered Charles, and she said she would like to escape prison again, but this time, legally, by walking through the front door. Was Linda Darby a cold-blooded killer who poisoned her husband for months before shooting him through the heart and setting his house on fire? Was she a master manipulator who lied about cancer, escaped prison, changed her identity, and fooled an entire community for 35 years? The police believed so. Their theory was straightforward. Linda had orchestrated everything. The harassment at their first home, the vandalism, the arson, the fake obituaries, all of it. They believed she had created a pattern of victimhood to disguise what she was really doing, slowly poisoning her husband with arsenic while making it look like they were both targets. And when the poison wasn't working fast enough, she shot him, set the house on fire, and almost got away with it. If that theory was true, then Linda wasn't just a killer, she was a planner. Someone who had spent months building toward this moment. The cancer lie wasn't just about spending money. It was about establishing a pattern of deception. The kind of person who could do that could certainly fool a small Tennessee town for 3 decades. But there's another side to this story. Or was she a woman convicted on circumstantial evidence by a jury that never heard her side of the story? A woman whose own lawyers failed her. A woman who spent 35 years proving she could live a peaceful, law-abiding life. The harassment was real. Their first home did burn down. Their car was vandalized. Those things happened to both of them. And if she had really planned Charles's murder, would she have left such an obvious trail? The shotgun behind a vending machine, the gasoline purchase, the wake-up call, the instructions to her daughter. Would a careful planner really be that careless? The answer depends on which Linda you believe in, the one before March 4th, 1970, or the one after. One thing remains certain. Charles Darby was the victim. He was 25. He was a father. He was a veteran. And somebody killed him. Whether that somebody was the woman who climbed over a barbed wire fence and disappeared for 35 years, that question has haunted 2 families, 2 communities, and 1 woman for over half a century. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.